the old lie, dulcem et decorum est, pro patria mori. Wilfred Owen and other poets describe the Great War, otherwise known as the First World War, in countless poems and novels, from the horrors of war to small glimpses of humanity. Video games set during the First World War are few and far in between, but excellent at depicting la Grande Guerre. In today's video, I will discuss how these few games do the Great War justice, by teaching about key facts about the war. First things first, roll the intro. More than 100 years have passed since the Great War, and while we have seen countless depictions of the Second World War in video games, the first one is less mainstream. The reasons why this is evident. The Second World War has a clear good versus bad narrative that needs no introduction and everyone is already familiar with. Nevertheless, while games depicting the First World War are fewer, there are 3 titles in particular that splendidly illustrate many aspects from the time era and the conflict. These 3 games are Valiant Hearts, 1111 Memories Retold, and Verdun. These are not the sole games set during the First World War, but are the 3 titles that in my opinion do a wonderful job not only at showing, but at teaching the player about the war. This video is not a collection of reviews. All of these 3 games are delightful for different reasons, but rather I will be using them as incipit to discuss the Great War, and explain how the games depict certain aspects of the conflict, from the basis all the way to curiosities and lesser known facts. But first, a quick introduction to all 3. Valiant Hearts The Great War is the first title I will be discussing today. Released in 2014 for the 100th anniversary from the start of the war and developed by the small Montpellier studio of Ubisoft, the game is a puzzle adventure game with a unique comic book style you see on screen. This was my first game about the Great War, and perhaps the best known. The second title I will bring today is 1111 Memories Retold, an indie title developed by DJ Art and Hardman Animations and published by Bandai Namco. The game was released for the 100th anniversary of the end of the war in 2018, and it shines with a unique impressionist art style, giving the vibe of a Claude Monet painting coming to life. Lastly, I will address Verdun, and particularly its sequel Tannenberg Isonzo. Developed by the Dutch indie studio M2H and was released close to the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Verdun, these are the only first-person shooters I will address in this video due to a unique and semi-realistic way they gamify trench warfare. I know that there are other games set during the First World War, like Battlefield 1. However, I do wish to keep this video compact, and I think Valiant Hearts, 1111 and Verdun will give us plenty to talk about. One last thing to mention before this video starts is that there are no heavy spoilers for the 3 games I discuss. I will however describe some aspects in detail, so if you wish to play any of these games blind run, skip to the other section of the video. Without any other premises, let us get started. On June 28, 1914, tensions, frictions, alliances, rivalries, the arms race, imperialism and a bullet in Sarajevo sparked what we now call the Great War. Valiant Hearts summarizes the start of the conflict with a beautiful cutscene that introduces the player to the stage of geopolitics in Europe that year, the unforgettable 1914. But Europe is not only borders, but rather people. Some of these people live simple lives across nations in mixed communities. When war broke out, many civilians had to make a choice between staying in their adopted nation or going back to the motherland, a choice Karl, one of the protagonists of the title, had to make. During the Great War, over 14 million people were dispatched across the continent, being one of the largest refugee crises in human history. Karl is not the only protagonist that is called to arms. Emile is a Frenchman that joins the army to find his son-in-law, and is one of the over 8 million Frenchmen that took part in the conflict. But not all men in the French army were born in France. Freddy, along 40,000 men, served in the Foreign Legion, fighting for France regardless of his origin. This was not the first time Foreign Legions were used either by France or another country, and it further made the World War that much more international. Men from the colonies, from Canada to India, took part in various battles across the European continent. In the game, the Indian Sikh regiment is the one that stands out the most, with their soldiers wearing the traditional dastar. These men from the colonies took part in many battles across the old continent, in the Battle of the Somme, of Gallipoli, of Ypres. During the Second Battle of Ypres, the German army has made usage for the first time of chlorine gas in war. I could describe the horrors the first victim must have felt, but Valiant Heart already does this visually, by depicting the dark yellow hell the battlefield has turned into. This truly gives another meaning to the words no man's land. But let us uplift this video by telling a more curious fact about the war. The German advance at the outbreak of the war towards France was swift. The famous Schiffen plan worked, and by invading Belgium, the French had an exposed flank that needed to be covered as fast as possible. The Germans were getting so close to Paris that taxi drivers from the city started transporting men in droves in the front line. A crazy plan that somehow worked. In the game, this is humorly depicted with Anne driving 4 blue-suited soldiers in the Celtic capital. And speaking of the French army, you may have noticed that the French soldiers have quite the fancy uniform in-game, with the average soldier dressed in a horizon blue coat with bright red trousers. While you may think this was an artistic choice from the developers, during the first year of the war, the French army did in fact use some Napoleonic-style uniforms. It may be obvious now why these uniforms were not suited for modern conflict, but do keep in mind that this was the first modern conflict, so the concept of camouflage was not that relevant. Even if the army did change their uniform later in the war, these changes came with their fair share of criticism by the soldiers, who grew attached to the old uniforms. We will talk about battle and battle dynamics later in the video, but I did want to mention one bloodshed in particular only depicted in Valiant Heart, and that is Vauquois. Everyone is familiar with trench warfare, but in the Battle of Verdun, the mines in Vauquois were used and expanded upon both at the French and the Germans, causing a peculiar underground war to occur. The game's rendition truly gives that claustrophobic feeling soldiers must have felt when stationed there. One thing the game does to teach all of these facts other than narrating them is by sending them in collectibles across the levels, filled with interesting information regarding the war. The game takes seriously its task to teach the player regarding the conflict, and I believe such mechanics are rich and well implemented. One fun fact I've noticed while playing the Italian translation of the game is that the trivial is directed towards the player. In the Italian version of the game there was information regarding the role Italy had during the war, and I believe this is for every translation present in the game. There are more war facts the game proposes in its narrative, but I either do not wish to dive into spoilers nor take too much from the other two blogs. Valiant Heart tells a wonderful story of tragic events, an odyssey filled with terror and humanity, of fear and of hope, and the game does a fantastic job at depicting the Great War. La Grande Guerre may have taken place mostly in Europe, but not all nations of the conflict were European. The Dominion of Canada sent over 500,000 men in the old continent to fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary, in what would be the biggest intervention of Canada in a European war before World War II. Harry, a young photographer from Toronto, one of them. Photography itself was invented in the early 1800s, but war photographers only became present and relevant in the late part of the century, with their pictures of the American Civil War and the Crimean War. By the time the Great War broke out, photographers from every country jumped into documenting and storing memories of the gruesome era. The protagonist of 11/11, just like Ernest Brooks, is a war photographer that tells a tale with images, not words. But photography is not the only invention that took off during the early 20th century. Aircraft of all kinds were taking off across the world to take part in the conflict. The infamous Zeppelins that we see Kurt build in a German factory conducted air raids over France, Belgium and even London herself, killing over 1,500 British civilians. These air balloons were massive, and the game does them justice by depicting them being constructed. Giant steel machines do not only roam the air, but also the land. The First World War takes credit for the invention of the first modern tank, as depicted in the game. The British were the first ones to use them in the Battle of Flers-Courtollet in the September of 1916, and are categorized with their land boat shape that you see on screen. But war was not only fought in land and air, it was fought in the sea too. To intercept British trade routes, the Germans invested heavily in what we now define as unrestricted submarine warfare. Many British, American and Canadian ships, as well from neutral countries like Brazil, were attacked by the Germans in the middle of the Atlantic. To fight these raids, the Allies laid down miles and miles of mines over the North Sea and the North Atlantic. Even with a mined ocean and the horrible condition of the trenches, communication back home with letters was remarkably possible to conduct. In the game, both Harry and Kurt write to and receive countless letters from their loved ones, being this a core part of the game's story. Just the British record sending over 2 billion, yes billion letters during the course of the war, with 19,000 mailbags crossing the channel every day. Speaking of trenches, it is a well-known fact that both sides built a network of trenches expanding thousands of kilometers across France, but did you know that the German trenches were built to last? German trenches had wooden reinforcements and had bigger living spaces than their English counterparts, which built the trenches out of mud. In the game, both trenches can be explored, and it is evident that Guerre developers put to remark this fact. The only way for a soldier to leave the trenches would be by death or capture. Prisoners of war were not a new concept, yet as you can imagine, the scale in comparison to previous conflicts was incomparable. We are speaking over 5 million POWs. The The numbers were so high and the war lasted for so long that prisoners of war provided a logistical nightmare for all countries involved. Some nationalities like Italians, Serbians and Romanians faced over 10% of the death rate in the Central Powers prison camps, places perhaps more dangerous than the front. The soldiers who made it back home may remember the tragic events that took place in No Man's Land, but also the red flowers that covered the battlefield. The poppies blow, between the crosses, Rome row, reads the first lines of Macrie's poem. We shall not sleep, for poppies grow in Flanders field. Can I even find the right words to describe the scenes from 11/11 Memories Retold? Combined with the spectacular visuals of the game, no scene in any media makes the Canadian poet's words come to life. Just like Valiant Heart, the game has some collectible that narrates facts about the war and the time period. I'm not too sure if these ones too were localized, but like they did in the previous title, this worked nicely to teach the player about its surroundings. There will be more to discuss, but I will let you explore the rest of the painted title that is 11/11 Memories Retold. While the other two games showcased a more human side of the conflict, I thought it would have been dishonest not to bring the war part of the First World War. Verdun, and to some extent Tannenberg and Isonzo, bring the player to the battlefield where he or she can experience the battle through over many nations. Even if the size of the Great War was colossal, the battles within them were static and consistent in what we now define as trench warfare. Millions upon millions have lost their lives to capture what at times were few square meters of the enemy, a war of attrition where the front moved slowly but the casualties grew exponentially. As described by Britannica Encyclopedia, lines of trenches were built along all fronts and series of attacks and counterattacks were carried out to capture the enemy bases. In the middle of both trenches we find No Man's Land, the most vulnerable place to be, an area where death runs supreme and all hope is lost. Verdun transformed this type of warfare into an interesting mode of attacks and counterattacks. In contrast to other first-person shooters, there is a time and place to advance or defend established by the game, making the experience of trench warfare more genuine. When you move to No Man's Land, be sure that half of your unit will not survive the first step, let alone the last. The game provides the player with various classes, from officers to melee experts to the infamous snipers, part of a balanced 4-player squads. The squads are based off real-life regiments like the Sturmtrupp, the Alpenjäger, the Highlanders and the Chasseurs Alpines. In fact, the Allies have a great variety of nationalities within their ranks, just like we previously discussed. Canadians, Belgians, Australians, New Zealanders, US Marines, English Tommies and Senegalese skirmishers are all present in the game, even if not all were present in the Battle of Verdun herself. Going back to the battles, many are the dangers soldiers face daily. Mustard gas and artillery are the two heavy surprises you will not be keen to face during an assault. We introduced chemical weapons, but did you know that artillery also played a crucial part in the war? Due to the static nature of the conflict, during the 4 years of the war, heavy artillery was used by both sides and caused uncountable casualties. Soldiers got so used to hearing bombardments that one source reported Tommies were able to distinguish between the sounds of various guns used. This article reports, soldiers under fire could identify artillery by specific noises they made. One combatant noted that the French 75mm gun had a sharp decisive note, which sparked quickly and in anger. Soldiers also spoke of the peculiar crack they made. The German 105mm howitzer was called a whizzy bang. Verdun is the traditional battle we think of when we think of World War I, but as already introduced, the trilogy of games also present two other scenarios for the player, the Eastern and Italian fronts. Tannenberg has a more dynamic game mode, since the Eastern Front itself was less static, while Isonzo has a greater focus on mountain-based combat due to the geographic location where the war took place. In Tannenberg more specifically, we can find yet more units from different nations that took part in the war, like Bulgaria and Romania, as well as some regional variants such as the Latvian riflemen. For the Italian front, we can of course fight with Italian, Austrian and Hungarian troops. To end this section with yet another fun fact, let us put the game on the 25th of December. Every year when the game is played on Christmas Eve, the front and the weapons used will look, different to say the least. Rather than to throw artillery shots, you'll be throwing snowballs and not accumulate kills, since you'll find yourself in the famous Christmas truce. Full documentaries have been done about the event, but long story short, in various parts of the front, German and English regiments spontaneously agreed for a Christmas truce. Soldiers from both sides of the trenches ended hostilities and at times even played football together and traded gifts. It is admirable that developers paid tribute to this event in the first-person shooter, and I think no better fact can conclude this part of the video. When this lousy war is over, no more soldiering for me. When I get my civic clothes on, oh, how happy I shall be. This old British song described the two ways the Great War ended. While many remember the Second World Conflict, I hope that today these three phenomenal games taught you or at least reminded you of about La Grande Guerre, her story, her tales, her curiosities and her tragedies. As stated in the introduction, these three titles are not the only ones set during the First World War, but are the ones that sparked the idea to make this, let's just say, unorthodox video. To learn everything about World War I would need a lifetime, but these three games can give you a good window into the conflict that changed the world forever. If you made it this far, I wish to thank you one too many Great War times for watching today's video. Like I said, this video is quite unique in comparison to others I've made, so do let me know if you liked it and wish to see more content like this in the future. As always, I invite you to leave this video a like, to share it and subscribe for more. I wish you a wonderful day. Arrivederci.